Alright, here it is again, and it's called the Bibliography Podcast. It's been a very long while, too long, in fact, definitely. There's been a lot going on, and for a long time I wasn't reading that much, and even though I finished my thesis, which I then handed in and got a decent result for, so congratulations to me. Yes, thank you. Even though I did all that, I felt like I didn't really have that much time. Not enough time to do one episode a month, which is a really bad excuse, actually. But anyway, here I am, because I have been reading again recently, and I enjoyed doing this podcast, even if I was only getting 100 people listening to it. And I've been reading some really, really good books. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it was, well, the thesis. That was hard work. That took forever to get done. But that is now done, so no excuses there anymore. And then started making a lot of music, quite a lot of drum and bass. Yeah. So that was taking up a lot of time. Then I had a bit of an accident and I tore 2 ligaments in my leg, and I also destroyed quite an important piece of cartilage. So there was quite a long recovery. I mean, the recovery period's still not over, actually. I'm almost exactly halfway through. About 6 months through, and there's about another 6 months to go, maybe 3 if I get lucky. 12 months to feel completely normal again. So, you know, had a lot on my mind. And as I say, because of all of that, I wasn't really reading. It's quite hard to find the concentration to read when you're in quite a lot of pain, which I was for quite a few weeks. Anyway, everyone can relax. They can hear me talking nonsense about books again. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the first novel in David Peace's early 2000 quartet, Red Riding. First novel is called 1974. It's a crime series, and it details, against the backdrop of the Yorkshire Ripper murders, it details essentially a paedophile ring in Yorkshire, Manchester, Leeds, some other places up that neck of the woods. Loads of it is based on truth, particularly the Yorkshire murders part. Some of the other crimes which take place in the novels are also based on actual crimes which happened. Oh, by the way, that weird intro I did, I was testing out the microphone with this new outboard compressor I've got. If you don't know what it is, it doesn't matter, it's not very interesting. Anyway, and it made that quite funny kind of echo effect. And what I said is the intro to a punk song by a band called Wire, called 12XU. Don't know why I left it in, but I did. So that's that. So, David Peace, 1974. Really excellent novel. It starts off by following a journalist called Eddie Dunford, who is a journalist for the Yorkshire Post, a crime reporter. And in the first few pages, a young girl is abducted and murdered. She's 10 years old. Her name's Claire Kempley. And essentially what follows is... Oh, I should say... Spoilers. Essentially what follows is this far-reaching conspiracy which implicates the police, the church, local businessmen, politicians, and none of it's explained until the 4th novel, the last one. And even in that, nothing's completely clearly explained, partly because of the writing style of Peace, which is quite cryptic, very stream of consciousness, contains lots of repetitions. He actually said that music is quite a big influence on his writing style, and there's a lot of repetition stuff that keeps coming back up, like refrains, like choruses. And it's quite an interesting style, because sometimes the choruses, in inverted commas, are different, very slightly, as an actual chorus might be, and sometimes they're exactly the same, repeated sort of over and over again. It gets kind of drilled into your head the way a singular thought might get stuck in your own head, as sometimes happens. that you just can't stop thinking about. So it's quite interesting in that sense. It does also make it a quicker read because you obviously don't have to read those bits word for word again. You can just skim them because you know exactly what is being said in that passage. And that's also quite interesting because it's stream of consciousness style, and you're skimming over the words. It's almost as though they're thoughts. It's more like their thoughts in that sense. Compared to stream of consciousness style, put my hands up, the best style there is, but of James Joyce in Ulysses or in Finnegan's Wake, where everything is different, everything is kind of interconnected. There aren't these repeating choruses, and you can also skim that just to kind of get a feel for what's going on, to get an impression. You're more likely to miss stuff, whereas in this, you're not necessarily going to miss anything. This little girl gets abducted and murdered, and this journalist, while he is investigating this murder, basically stumbles across this conspiracy, which encompasses a large range of prostitutes across the Yorkshire area who were involved in essentially this secretive porn industry run by the police, and this linked, but not necessarily the same, paedophile ring. One of the refrains which Peace uses is this sort of recurring idea of swans, and it's based on this architect called John Dawson, who has this obsession with swans. And part of the conspiracy is that he wants to build this shopping centre. Essentially, the whole thing revolves around money and lust. And somehow this murder happens is that she is found, this little girl, when her body is eventually found, is found in a ditch, and she's had swan's wings sewn into her back. It's pretty fucking gruesome, actually. And this idea of swans keeps popping up again and again in all 4 of the novels. So that's just, I'm only saying that just as one of the examples of this recurring imagery that keeps coming up again and again and again. And it doesn't matter which character you're focused on, it keeps coming up. Because the first book is narrated from the perspective of this journalist, Eddie Dunford, portrayed, by the way, by Andrew Garfield in the film, which came out. But all of the other novels are narrated by other characters. So you meet 2 of them in 1974 in the first novel, Jack Whitehead and Bob Fraser. Jack Whitehead's another journalist, Bob Fraser's a police officer. And those are the 2 people who narrate 1977. It's interesting because all of the characters' voices are similar, but still you can distinguish between them. And one of the ways you can distinguish between them is because the tenses are different. It's such a simple idea for distinguishing between voices. But when I first kind of realised, because you don't necessarily realise what tense you're reading straight away, but when I first realised that the tenses were switching, I thought it was really clever despite being quite simple. So in the second novel, 1977, for example, Jack Whitehead's narration, which switches chapter by chapter most of the time, is in the past tense, first person past tense, and Bob Fraser's narration is in first person present tense. It's not the only difference, but the voices are really quite similar, as I say. But it's interesting because it gives this sense of urgency to Bob Fraser's narrative, which you don't necessarily get with Jack Whitehead's. That's more of an aside, really, because I'm going to do an episode on each of the novels, at the risk of repeating myself. We'll see. Another recurring theme which keeps coming up, especially in 1974, the first novel, but also in all of the others, is this idea of time. 2 of the characters in the first novel and the third, 1974 and 1980, they all take place 3 years after the last novel. So those 2 characters, Edward Dunford and Peter Hunter, who narrate both of those 2 novels in the quartet respectively, are both wearing their father's watch, and it's something that keeps coming up as David Peace says, this chorus or refrain, where they keep looking at their father's watch. As the story gets more urgent, they're looking at it more frequently, and at some point, when the story in 1974 comes to a climax, his watch stops, and it's as though time has stood still, and everything falls into place kind of all at once within the space of maybe 1 chapter. And that's really, really interesting. And in 1980, for example, Peter Hunter's watch, he takes it off because he gets a new one as a present. And in that, it's almost the opposite. The narrative picks up, but time slows down because he has an analog, his father's watch is an analog watch, which he ends up losing in a fire. And he gets a digital watch as a present. And so every time he refers to his watch, it goes from just giving you minutes and hours to giving you seconds as well. And that kind of slows down his thoughts while the narrative picks up. It's quite interesting how time is used in this way. Time is kind of not realistic in the novels at all. People light cigarettes, and 3 or 4 lines later, they're being stubbed out and a new one's being lit, as though they've smoked them extremely quickly, or they've barely smoked them at all. Eddie Dunford in 1974 is constantly jumping back in his car and heading to a new place to interview a new witness, or to go and find an important spot for the reportage which he's attempting to write. Each chapter in the first novel is 1 day of action, and just the amount he manages to pack into 1 day is just completely unrealistic. One of the other things which I actually found kind of funny about the novels is that sort of the context of the characters' lives isn't really taken into account when it comes to their emotions. So the books are really, really tragic. There's a happy ending for basically nobody throughout the whole quartet, and people are constantly having breakdowns and feeling like absolute shit and vomiting, for example. The other side of this is that they are almost all dependent on alcohol to a greater or lesser extent. In the third novel, for example, which one third of it follows this narrator, John Pigott, who's a lawyer. He's constantly up drinking until 2 a.m. and then up again in the morning at 6 or 7 a.m. And it's never taken into account that part of the reason why he sort of is having this breakdown and is feeling so sick all the time and is constantly vomiting is because he has this alcohol dependency, and he's just often hungover. And I always found it quite funny while reading, because the gravity of the situations the characters are in are implied to be the cause for why they feel so terrible. And of course, they are. But it's also the fact that lots of these characters are just horrible drunks, and they're just drinking all the time and then racing around all day, every day, getting no sleep. And it was just something I found quite funny. It was sort of this one piece of humour in what are otherwise 4 completely tragic, depressing, and at times really, really scary novels. They're not scary in a Stephen King sense, but just very deeply unsettling. It's one of the things that these novels do really, really well, which is to capture perhaps not a realistic, but maybe sort of a mood of a place or a period of time. I imagine when the Yorkshire Ripper was on his spree for about 6 years in Yorkshire, it was a terrifying time to live there and to be around, and I mean, especially as a woman. And the novels kind of capture this nightmarish Yorkshire where it's almost always dark, it's almost always grey, it's almost always raining. There is almost nothing redeeming about the picture of Yorkshire which David Peace paints. All of the coppers are bent. Nobody has a happy ending. The story itself is based on one of the most horrific killing sprees in the history of the United Kingdom. There is just nothing. There is nothing good or virtuous or bright in these novels whatsoever. And David Peace acknowledges this himself, and he says that it's all on purpose in order to really bring home the true horror of crime, particularly true crime. In interviews, he's stated how he really, really dislikes crime as entertainment. And although I kind of think it's tosh, bollocks, bullshit, because whatever he says, these books are entertainment because they are novels, they're art, even if they were non-fiction, and they verge on non-fiction in lots of points, but even if they were true non-fiction, they would still be entertainment. The written word almost always is in some form or another, except maybe some like horrible articles by Judith Butler or whatever. Regardless, he says that there's no way of making tasteful crime fiction if you are making light of what's actually happened. and crime is horrible and depraved, etc., etc. And that's the reason these novels are so horrifically dark and difficult to read and scary and depraved and void of light and sun. So as I've mentioned, the two middle novels, 1977 and 1980, are framed against the backdrop of the Yorkshire Ripper killings. The first one in particular, the one I'm talking about in this episode predominantly, is very, very closely to the true story of the murder of Leslie Molseed, who was killed in West Yorkshire, and this mentally impaired man called Stephen Kisco went down for it, but was innocent. And he served 16 years in prison before finally being acquitted. Well, before his conviction was overturned, rather. There's a strong resemblance to that case in 1974, because a man named Michael Mishkin is essentially tortured while being interrogated by the police and is forced into confessing because they told him essentially that it would be better for him if he confessed and he would be able to see his mother. It was a huge miscarriage of justice, and he was given compensation for the fact that he was put away something like £500,000, but he died before he was ever able to collect it. And the theory is that his time in prison was so horrific for him that he never really recovered when he was released. And it's one of the worst miscarriages of justice, second maybe only to the Cardiff Five, which was where 5 black and mixed race men were charged with the killing of Lynette White in Cardiff, and 3 of them were convicted and spent about 2 years in jail before they were released, before they were acquitted. And it took another 10 years, 11 years after they were released for the real murderer to be found. And in this Leslie Molseed case, which 1974 bases a lot of its story on, it also took until 2006 for the real murderer to be found. So what's interesting about the first novel is that Eddie Dunford essentially exposes the real murderer of Claire Kempley, because he finds out during the course of his investigation that the police are unbelievably corrupt. He takes matters into his own hands, finds a shotgun and attempts to kill as many of the people involved as he possibly can, and he kills a fair few of them. The actual paedophile murderer he finds in this paedophile's lair, which he's created in this disused coal mine, and he's already been castrated, his eyes have been gouged out, and he's been left to die in this dungeon that he's created, essentially. And you find out in later novels who's done that, which I'll get to in a later episode. And it's interesting because even though you kind of see that Dunford has pieced the whole story together, you kind of still don't really understand anything. All he sort of finds out is that there's insane police corruption and that these horrific murders are going on, and he wants to exact vengeance on these people who have committed these crimes. But you still don't really understand how it all fits together. And it takes quite a long time and 3 more novels until that happens. A large portion of the full story is cleared up in the final novel, 1983, but there's still quite a few unanswered questions, and unless you went through all of the novels with a fine-tooth comb, you wouldn't ever really be able, well, even if you did that, you still can't piece together everything. And there are theories that David Peace did this on purpose in order to replicate real-life crimes where motives aren't always clear and where there aren't always full answers or answers to every question. And I find that idea really, really interesting, to construct your novel and leave unanswered questions, because, as David Peace himself says, the whodunit entertainment value of crime is that all of the questions are eventually answered, and there's this light bulb moment where everything becomes clear. In his novels, lots and lots of things are left unclear. Most characters don't get redemption. They are all really drastically affected by what has happened and the experiences that they've had. And it's a really, really nice way to replicate the horror of true crime more faithfully than most crime fiction does. Those are my thoughts on the first novel in the series, and some thoughts which I will expand upon in the next episodes, going through these novels. And I look forward to talking about the rest of them, despite the fact that they are horrific and depraved. And to be honest, you don't really have a good time reading them. That being said, I cannot recommend this series enough. It's so interesting, very well written, interestingly written in its stream of consciousness style and its repetition, its musicality. If you can find the first one cheaply, which probably can online, then I really recommend reading it, and you will want to keep reading to try and figure out what is going on in this dark, gloomy Yorkshire that David Peace has created.